She built that empire with her bare hands, and the very man she loved most used those same hands to sign her death warrant. One rainy night, it all crumbled. The company, her honor, her reputation. But what no one knew, the one watching her being crushed in the shadows, wasn't an enemy. And 3 years later, when she returned to the city in a blood-red dress, what awaited her wasn't forgiveness. It was war. Like and comment the name of the city you're viewing so I know how far this story has progressed. Then read to the end, because you won't guess the ending. The rain came in sideways that night, not falling so much as attacking. Sheets of cold water that slammed against the glass tower of Cross Veyne Holdings like something with a grudge. 42 floors up, the boardroom blazed white under fluorescent lights, every seat filled, every face turned toward the screen at the front of the room where the numbers told a story Selene Veyne had never written. She sat at the end of the table she had personally chosen. Black lacquered mahogany, imported from a mill in Vermont that no longer existed, and watched the projected slides cycle through financial records she had never seen before. Her breathing was even. She had trained it to be. 12 years of building something from the bones of her father's failed consulting firm had taught her that boardrooms were theaters, and the most dangerous thing you could do in a theater was let the audience see your hands shake. Her hands were not shaking, but her chest was doing something that felt like drowning. As you can see, Damien said, clicking to the next slide, the irregularities span a period of nearly 18 months. He stood at the front of the room with his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his voice carrying the precise weight of a man performing grief. Damien Cross was good-looking in the way that certain structures were good-looking. All clean lines and engineered symmetry, nothing organic about it. He had the jaw and the posture and the voice that boardrooms responded to, and he knew exactly how to use each one. He also knew exactly what he was doing. Selene understood that now, watching him from across the length of that table she had chosen. She understood it in the way you understand a car crash while it is still happening, too fast to stop, too close to look away from. The offshore accounts trace back to a routing system authorized under Selene's executive credentials, Damien continued. We have documentation from 3 separate auditing firms. Those documents are forged. Her voice came out flat. Not loud, not fractured, just flat, like stone. Every head in the room turned toward her. 26 board members, 7 legal observers, 2 representatives from the investment consortium that held the largest stake in Cross Veyne Holdings. All of them looking at her the way people look at something broken, with a mixture of fascination and discomfort, and the quiet, shameful relief that it wasn't them. Selene, Damien's voice dropped into something soft and regretful, and that softness was worse than anger would have been. No one wants this to be true. I said those documents are forged. She stood up. The chair scraped back against the marble floor, and she let it, because sometimes the sound of something scraping was the only honest thing in a room. I have never had access to any offshore routing system under this company's structure. The accounts you're describing were not authorized by me. They were not created by me. And every person in this room who has been with this company longer than 3 years knows that the compliance protocols I personally implemented would have made that impossible without a secondary authorization. Silence. The kind that has weight to it. Then Marcus Fell, the oldest member of the board, a man with liver-spotted hands and 40 years of watching companies eat their own founders, cleared his throat. Ms. Veyne, the auditing documentation is fabricated. She looked directly at him. Marcus, you've known me for 9 years. You knew my father. Do you honestly believe? I believe, Damien said, cutting across her with the quiet precision of a man who had rehearsed this moment, that the evidence speaks for itself. And I believe that the appropriate course of action, in order to protect the company and its stakeholders, is to suspend Ms. Veyne's executive access pending a full independent investigation. The word suspend landed in the room like something thrown from a height. Selene felt it land, felt the specific, particular pain of it. Not the word itself, but the silence that came after it. The silence of 26 people who had attended her company Christmas parties and sent flowers when her father died, and shaken her hand at every quarterly success. And not one of them was going to say a word. She looked at Damien. He looked back at her. And for just a fraction of a second, barely enough to exist, barely enough to be real, she saw something behind his eyes that wasn't grief and wasn't regret. It was satisfaction. Clean, cold, and complete. She had married it. She had slept beside it for 6 years. She had built an empire with it and called it love. "You should know," she said, and her voice was very quiet now, "that I will find out exactly how you did this." Damien bowed his head slightly, as if she had said something sad. 2 security guards appeared at the boardroom door. They were polite about it. They always were, Selene would think later. The men who escort you out of your own life are almost always polite about it. One of them, a heavy-shouldered man named Torres, who had worked building security for 4 years, and who Selene had personally approved a raise for the previous spring, touched her arm with professional gentleness and said, "Ms. Veyne, if you could come with us." She picked up her phone from the table. Nothing else. She had brought nothing else because she had walked into this meeting expecting a quarterly review, and somewhere in the last 20 minutes, the floor had opened up beneath her. As they walked her toward the elevator, she could hear Damien's voice resuming behind her, smooth, regretful, already moving forward, already building the narrative, already burying her. The lobby was full of cameras. She had not expected that. Later, she would understand that was the point, that Damien had tipped the entertainment media, the financial press, the gossip feeds, all of them, because the public humiliation wasn't a side effect of his plan. It was the plan. A woman walking out of her own company under escort was a story that could live for weeks. It could reshape perception so thoroughly that even if she fought back, even if she proved every document was forged, the image would remain. The image of Selene Veyne being removed from the building she had named herself. The flashes went off like something rupturing. She kept walking, head up, jaw set, hands loose at her sides. Every camera she passed she looked directly into because she refused to give them the image of a woman hiding her face. And if she was going to be photographed, she was going to be photographed looking like someone who was going to come back. Outside, rain hit her like a punishment. She had no umbrella. She had not planned to need one. She stood on the steps of Cross Vane Holdings for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to feel the cold water soak through her blazer and understand that her phone was already blowing up. The board's official statement had clearly gone out before she even reached the lobby. And then she moved, because standing still was not something she knew how to do. She called her lawyer from the car, got voicemail, called again. Voicemail. Sent a text that said, "Call me immediately," and received, 40 minutes later, a reply that said, "I need to recuse myself from this matter." "I'm sorry, Selene." The lawyer she had used for 9 years. The one she had personally referred 3 separate clients to. She called her bank at 11:40 p.m., using the executive line she had memorized because she never stored important numbers in her phone. The customer service representative, a young woman who was clearly reading from a script someone had prepared, told her that her accounts had been flagged for investigation pending a regulatory review, and that access had been temporarily suspended under Section 4.7 of the account terms and conditions. "How much is left?" Selene said. A pause. "Ms. Veyne, I'm not in a position to—" "How much?" Another pause. Longer. "The primary account reflects a balance of $214. She was in a rideshare car. The driver was listening to something in another language through one earbud and not paying attention to her. Rain tracked down the windows and rivers. Outside, Blackmere City glittered the way it always did, indifferent and beautiful and completely without mercy. $214. 6 years of her life. 12 years of her career. The company her father had started in a 2-room office with secondhand furniture and a business plan written on yellow legal pad. The empire she had rebuilt from his wreckage. The name she had spent every waking hour making worth something. $214. She did not cry. She noticed the absence of tears the way you notice the absence of sound in a room where something loud just stopped. The silence itself was a kind of sensation. She sat with her wet blazer and her nearly dead phone and her $214, and she tried to calculate what came next. The car stopped in front of her building. Her building, or rather, the building where she and Damien had lived for 3 years, the 45th floor penthouse that was registered under a corporate holding, she now understood she had no access to. She went up anyway, because she had nowhere else to go and her clothes were soaked and she needed 30 minutes to think. The door wouldn't open. She stood in the hallway of the 45th floor and pressed her key card against the reader 3 times before she accepted what it meant. The locks had been changed. The key card had been deactivated. She was standing in a carpeted hallway with a dead phone and wet shoes outside an apartment she had lived in for 3 years, and it had already been scrubbed of her. She slid down against the wall. Just for a moment, just long enough to press the heels of her palms against her eyes and breathe. In through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth, 4 counts, and make herself understand the geometry of what had happened to her. It was while she was sitting there, on the floor of a hallway that smelled like carpet cleaner and other people's cooking, that she heard the voices inside. Not voices. A voice. And then laughter. Female laughter, low and intimate, the kind that has history in it. Selene knew that laugh. She had heard it at birthday dinners and long weekends at the lake house and lazy Sunday brunches that stretched into afternoon wine. She had heard it at her own wedding, from the front row, where Vivica Hale had sat in a pale blue dress with tears in her eyes that Selene had believed were happy. She stood up very slowly. She knocked. The voices stopped. There was a long pause, long enough for 2 people to exchange a look, to make a decision, to arrange their faces. Then the door opened. Damien was still in his dress shirt, but the tie was gone. His hair was slightly disordered. He looked at her with something that might have been surprise, if surprise could be rehearsed. "Selene, how long?" she said. He blinked. "How long?" she said again, and her voice was remarkably steady, which frightened her more than if it had broken, because it meant some part of her had already known, had been knowing for some time, and had chosen not to look directly at it. Vivica appeared behind him. She was in Damien's shirt. She held a glass of wine. A Bordeaux. Selene recognized the bottle on the counter behind them. It was from the case she had ordered for the company anniversary dinner, and her expression was complicated in the way that expressions are complicated when they contain guilt and defiance in equal measure, and neither one wins. "Selene," Vivica said, "I think—" "Don't." Selene held up one hand. "Don't manage me right now." "We should talk," Damien said, in the tone of a man who believes he can still control the conversation. 14 months, Vivica said suddenly. Damien looked at her sharply. "She asked," Vivica said, not unkindly, almost gently, which was somehow worse than cruelty. 14 months. Selene stood in the doorway of her own home and looked at her husband and her best friend and did the arithmetic. 14 months ago, she had been restructuring the company's Asia-Pacific division and working 70-hour weeks and coming home to Damien's careful domesticity. The dinners he made, the questions he asked, the way he always seemed to know when she needed silence and when she needed conversation. And understanding now that all of it, the attention and the care and the apparent devotion, had been performance. Cover. The distraction of a man who needed her not to look too closely. She thought about her father. His funeral, 3 years ago. Damien's hand on her back. His voice in her ear saying, "I've got you. I've always got you." She took a breath. "You'll be hearing from someone," she said. She turned around and walked back down the hallway. She took the stairs. 45 flights, because she needed the time to organize herself, and because standing in an elevator felt like being buried. By the 32nd floor, her legs were burning and her soaked shoes had rubbed a blister on her left heel, and she was constructing a list in her head. Legal options, financial options, media options, every angle she could think of, building strategy from the rubble the way her father had taught her. You start with what you have, and you move forward, Selene. You always move forward. But underneath the strategy there was something else. Something she couldn't yet name. A cold, clarifying rage that was not like the hot anger she'd felt in the boardroom. This was different. This was the kind of anger that settles in your bones and becomes structural. She came out onto the ground floor lobby. The building's night concierge looked up, recognized her, and very carefully looked away, which told her the news had reached even here, which meant it had reached everywhere. The rain was still coming down. She pushed through the front door and stood on the wet sidewalk of Meridian Avenue at 11:53 p.m. with $214 to her name and a blister on her left heel and nowhere to be, and she made herself breathe, and she made herself think, and she told herself she was going to survive this because the alternative was unacceptable, and she had never accepted unacceptable things. The black armored car was parked at the far end of the block. She almost didn't notice it. It was designed not to be noticed. No plates visible from the angle she was standing, no identifying markings, the kind of matte black that absorbed rather than reflected the orange of the streetlights. But it was there, and it had been there long enough that the rain had beaded on its hood in a particular way that meant it had been stationary for some time. As she stood there, the window lowered 2 inches. Not enough to see inside, just enough to let her know she'd been seen. She stared at the car. The car did not move. The window stayed down those 2 inches, rain tapping against the door, and whoever was inside made no further gesture and gave no signal. And after 30 seconds, Celine's instincts, 12 years of reading rooms and people and situations, told her 2 contradictory things simultaneously: that she should walk away from that car immediately, and that walking away from it was already not an option. A rideshare pulled up beside her, the one she had booked from the 32nd floor landing, and she got in, and as the car pulled away, she looked back through the rear window. The black armored car pulled out from the curb. It followed her, not aggressively, not closing the distance, just there, 2 cars back, steady as a shadow, through 4 intersections and a tunnel and the long curve of the Harbor Road, until the rideshare turned into the parking lot of the Harrow Hotel, the only place Selene had been able to book on short notice with the one credit card that apparently hadn't been frozen yet. When she looked back from the hotel entrance, the black car was parked across the street, and it stayed there all night. She lay in the hotel room with the lights off and the curtains cracked and watched the car across the street while the rain finally slowed to a drizzle, and she tried to understand what kind of threat would follow her to a mid-rate hotel in Blackmere's Harbor District rather than making a move, and couldn't because the logic of it didn't fit anything she knew about the kind of enemies a corporate executive made. She fell asleep near 4 a.m. still watching the window. When she woke at 6, the car was gone. 3 days later, her lawyer, the original one, not the one who'd recused himself, but the corporate litigation partner she'd cold-called at midnight the day after the board meeting, a former federal prosecutor named Greta Lim, who had a reputation for eating insurance companies for lunch, called to tell her that the forged documents were good. Very good. Not good enough to fool a forensic accountant, not in the long run, but good enough to slow the courts down for 18 months. Good enough to keep Celine's name buried while the story calcified in the public consciousness. Good enough to ensure that by the time the truth emerged, if it emerged, the company would already be unrecognizable. They had help, Greta said. The level of forgery, the routing documentation especially, someone with real financial infrastructure put this together. Someone with access to banking systems most individuals can't touch. Damien has connections, Selene said. Not to people who can do this. Greta was quiet for a moment. Selene, the accounts that were used, 2 of the routing nodes trace back to shell corporations with addresses in territories that are associated with organized crime, Eastern Syndicate territory specifically. Selene was quiet. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the size of what you're dealing with, Greta said. This wasn't just a husband who wanted a divorce and decided to take the company. Someone helped him build this. Someone with resources and infrastructure that go well past corporate. Someone who wanted me gone, Selene said slowly. Or someone who wanted something you had, or something you were getting close to. Greta paused again. I want to keep working this case, but I need you to be careful, Selene. Whoever helped Damien Cross do this to you, they may not be done. 3 hours after that call, Selene received a note. Not an email. An actual note. Cream-colored cardstock slid under the door of her hotel room while she was in the shower. She found it on the floor in a shaft of morning light, and she stood dripping on the tile and read the 4 words written in a clean, spare hand. You are not alone. No signature. No contact information. Nothing on the reverse side. She sat on the edge of the bed with the note in her hand for a long time. Outside, the city moved through its morning routines, the harbor traffic and the delivery trucks, and the distant percussion of a city that had watched her fall and filed it away and continued. And Selene Veyne made a decision that had been building in her chest since the moment she had sat on that hallway floor and heard Vivica Hale's laughter through a door that used to be hers. She was not leaving Blackmere. She was not fighting this from a distance or through the slow machinery of courts and public opinion and the careful management of narrative. She was going to find out exactly what had been done to her and who had helped do it, and she was going to take apart everything they had built on the bones of her life. She was going to need help to do it, the kind of help that didn't announce itself, the kind that left notes under doors. She set the cream card on the nightstand and picked up her phone. The black car was parked in the lot below the hotel window. It had come back. The black car didn't move when she stood at the window looking down at it. Selene stood there for 3 full minutes, wet hair darkening the collar of the hotel bathrobe. The cream card held flat against her palm. The lot below was half empty at this hour. A few commercial vehicles, a rideshare idling near the entrance, 2 sedans that belonged to guests. The black car occupied the far corner, nose angled toward the exit, the way a predator orients itself toward open ground rather than walls. It was a small thing to notice. She noticed it. She got dressed. Not the ruined blazer from 2 nights ago, which had dried stiff with rain residue and was now folded in a plastic bag that represented, along with her phone and her one functional credit card, the complete material inventory of her current life. She'd bought 3 changes of clothes from a pharmacy 2 blocks over, the kind of clothes that came vacuum-sealed in plastic, shapeless, impractical, and deeply unglamorous. And she put on dark jeans and a gray pullover and her still damp shoes, and she went downstairs. She walked out the front entrance, not the side door, because she was done with side doors. The morning air off the harbor smelled like diesel and brine, and the particular organic decay of tidal flats at low water. Blackmere's harbor district was not a glamorous part of the city. It was the working edge, the part that made everything else possible, and received no credit for it. Selene had grown up 2 miles from here, in the kind of neighborhood where your ambitions were treated as a personal affront by people who'd surrendered theirs, and she had spent her entire adult life deliberately not coming back. She crossed the lot, walked directly toward the black car. The driver's window came down when she was 10 feet away. The man behind the wheel was in his 50s, broad-faced, with close-cropped gray hair, and the particular stillness of someone professionally trained to have it. He looked at her without expression. "I want to talk to whoever's been watching me," Selene said. The man looked at her for a moment. Then he reached over and unlocked the rear door. She got in. The interior smelled like leather and something faintly chemical, like cleaning solvent over something older. The partition between front and rear was glass, tinted but not blacked out, and the rear seat was a bench configuration that took up the full width of the vehicle. She was alone in the back. The driver put the car in gear without speaking and pulled out of the lot, and Selene sat with her hands on her knees and watched Blackmere slide past the windows and did not ask where they were going, because asking where you were going implied you had the option of going somewhere else, and she had already decided she didn't. They drove for 22 minutes. She counted intersections. The building they stopped at was in the Aldgate corridor, the stretch of converted industrial space on the city's northwest edge, where the money had come in 15 years ago and restructured the bones of old manufacturing plants into something that looked like commerce but functioned like privacy. 6 stories of reclaimed brick, no signage, the kind of windows that were tinted from inside and mirrored from outside. A loading bay that had been converted to a private entrance with the kind of understated security infrastructure, cameras positioned at angles that covered blind spots, a door with no visible handle, that you only recognized if you'd spent time around people who needed it. The driver pulled in, cut the engine. "Second floor," he said. Those were the only words he spoke. She went through the loading bay entrance, up a stairwell that was clean and spare and very quiet, and through a door on the second floor into a room that was not what she expected. She had been constructing expectations during the drive, either something aggressively luxurious, the taste of someone who needed to perform power, or something aggressively utilitarian, the taste of someone who didn't care what you thought about them. This was neither. The room was large and organized around function rather than display. A long work table with several monitors, bookshelves that held actual books alongside file storage, 2 leather chairs positioned around a low table near the windows, and standing at those windows, with his back to her, a man looking out over the Aldgate rooftops. He was taller than she'd anticipated, though she couldn't have said what she'd been anticipating. Dark clothing, well cut, no adornment, His hands were clasped behind his back, the right thumb pressing into the left palm, the way people do when they're holding themselves still. He had dark hair, cropped close at the sides, and when he turned to look at her, she understood immediately that his face was one of those faces that resisted being summarized. Not handsome in any conventional catalog sense, but with a quality of attention in it that was more arresting than handsome. His eyes were the particular gray-green of deep harbor water, and they were, she noted, completely without performance. No warmth designed to put her at ease. No coldness designed to intimidate. Just assessment, direct and unhurried. "Selene Veyne," he said. Not a question. "You've been following me for 3 days," she said, "and you left a note under my door, which means you have access to the hotel staff, or you have access to the building itself, and either way, you went to considerable trouble to tell me 4 words. So whatever comes after this, it better be worth the 4 words. Something crossed his face. Not a smile exactly. The ghost of an acknowledgement. "Lucienne Draven," he said. She knew the name. Everyone in Blackmere knew the name. It circulated in the city's consciousness the way certain names do, half fact and half mythology, accumulating detail with each retelling until the actual person became almost beside the point. Lucienne Draven. The East Coast's most established criminal organization, inherited from a father who'd built it from immigrant network roots in the 60s and then expanded it into something that looked, from certain angles, almost corporate. Lucienne had taken control at 31, after his father's death, and had spent the following decade either legitimizing or insulating various enterprise arms, depending on whom you asked and how much they owed him. What she hadn't expected was for him to be standing in a room in Aldgate in plain daylight, looking at her like he was going to ask her to sit down. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He didn't. He moved to the table and stood with one hand on the back of the opposite chair, which put them at a conversational distance that wasn't confrontational, but wasn't accommodating either. She recognized it as a deliberate arrangement. She recognized most things as deliberate, with him, almost immediately. "Your husband laundered money through 3 of my subsidiary operations," Lucian said. "Over 14 months, without my knowledge." She looked at him. "The routing nodes your lawyer found," he continued. "They trace back to shell corporations that sit underneath a holding structure I own, which means whoever helped Damien Cross build your frame used my infrastructure to do it." "Without your knowledge," she repeated. "Without my knowledge. And you expect me to believe that?" "I expect you to consider it," he said, "whether you believe it takes longer." She studied him for a moment, his hand on the chair back, the stillness she'd noted in the driver, the same quality but more refined, more interior, as if he had been practicing it from a younger age, the gray-green eyes that had not moved from her face. "So someone used your network to frame me," she said, "which creates a problem for you." "It creates several problems. Because it connects your infrastructure to a corporate fraud case that is currently attracting federal attention. Among other reasons." "What are the other reasons?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, more like he was deciding how much of the architecture to show her at once. "I've been building a case against Damien Cross for 18 months, he said. "Money laundering, primarily. He approached my network through an intermediary. We tracked the contact, let it develop, gathered documentation. The intention was to hand it to a specific federal contact of mine and remove him from the board of a financial consortium he's been corrupting." A pause. "When your frame was built using my infrastructure, it complicated that. It connected your case to mine in ways that make both harder to move." "You were going to hand Damien to the feds," Selene said slowly. "Yes." "Before I knew any of this?" "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. The harbor light through the tinted windows gave the room a particular quality, flattened, slightly blue, like light at the bottom of something. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because the situation changed." He moved finally, pulling the chair out and sitting in it, which somehow made the room feel different, not smaller, but more actual. 3 days ago, I received information from inside Damien's operation that they intend to move against you more permanently. The public destruction wasn't the end point, it was preparation. Preparation for what? Making sure you can't fight back. She looked at him steadily. "You mean they want to kill me?" I mean, they've already tried once. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set a photograph on the table between them. Your car accident, 6 weeks before the board meeting. You told the police it was a mechanical failure. She looked at the photograph. It was a traffic camera still, time-stamped, showing a dark SUV alongside her car on the Harrow overpass. Close alongside. The angle of contact she'd felt that night. The one she'd convinced herself was road debris, or her own inattention because the alternative had seemed paranoid, was visible in the image as deliberate. A nudge, calibrated to put her against the barrier but not over it. A warning, not a kill shot. Not yet. They wanted to scare me, she said, before the board meeting. They wanted you off balance when it happened, less likely to respond clearly. His voice was neutral, factual, the way someone delivers information they've already processed their own reaction to. You weren't supposed to survive the aftermath the way you have. I haven't survived anything yet, she said. I have $200 in a hotel room. You have something they didn't account for. He looked at her steadily. You're not reacting the way people react when they've actually done something wrong. I know what I did and didn't do. So do I. Another pause. I want to make a proposal. You want to use me, she said. I want to share a problem. He leaned forward slightly. You need resources, legal infrastructure, and information about the full scope of what Damien built. I need someone with credible standing in the corporate and media landscape to be the public face of what I'm going to expose. You can't fight this from my side of the line. The moment your name is associated with mine, it destroys your credibility. And I can't fight it from your side of the line because I'm structurally invisible to the circles where this damage needs to be done. She was quiet. Outside, a gull went past the window screaming. Partners? She said. Parallel tracks, he said. You do what you can do, I do what I can do. We share intelligence. And what do you get out of it? My name off those routing nodes before the federal investigation gets there. His eyes didn't move. And Damien Cross in a position where he can't take anyone else apart. She looked at him for a long time. He let her look. He didn't shift or soften or offer anything further. He had made his case, and he was waiting, and the waiting was itself a form of respect that she noted because she was not accustomed to receiving it in the past several days. I need a week, she said, to verify what you've told me. Take 2. She stood. He stood when she did, which she also noted. One thing, she said at the door. The note. You are not alone. Why that? He was quiet for a moment. Because you were sitting in a hallway on a wet floor at midnight, he said, and you were already planning your next move. And I thought you should know someone could see that. She left without answering, but she had already stopped looking for the exits. The 2 weeks she'd asked for became 10 days. She spent them in a systematic reconstruction. Not of her life, not yet, but of the map of what had been done to her. Greta Lim proved invaluable, not because she was warm, she was not. She communicated primarily in declarative sentences and had the emotional range of a well-organized filing system. But because she was relentless and specific, and she hated sloppy fraud the way some people hated bad faith. Together, they traced the document chain, identified the auditing firms Damien had used, and found, buried in the incorporation records of one of them, a shared registered agent that connected to a holding structure Selene hadn't seen before. The holding structure connected to Vivica Hale's family trust. Selene sat in Greta's conference room at 11 p.m. with that document in front of her and felt something settle in her chest that she didn't have a clean word for. Not surprise. Surprise had burned out on the floor of the hallway. This was something more like completion, the last piece of a shape that had been assembling itself in her peripheral vision for some time, finally rotating into clarity. Vivica hadn't just helped with the affair. Vivica had helped build the frame. She called Lucien from the parking garage below Greta's building. He picked up on the second ring. Vivica Hale's trust is in the documentation chain, she said without preamble. I know. A pause. We flagged it 6 days ago. She stood in the concrete quiet of the garage, her reflection fragmented in the security mirror at the far end of the level. You could have told me. You needed to find it yourself. His voice was even. If you'd found it because I told you, it would have sat differently. She wanted to argue with that. She couldn't, quite, because he wasn't wrong. There's something else, he said. My surveillance team tracked a meeting last night between Damien and a man named Royce Pellerin. Pellerin represents the Carver Syndicate, the group that's been pressing my western territory for 18 months. Damien is dealing with your competitors. Damien is trying to buy protection from my competitors, which means he knows I'm moving against him and he's looking for a counterweight. A brief pause. It also means whatever timeline we were working with just compressed. She leaned against a concrete pillar. Overhead, a fluorescent tube flickered in its casing. How compressed? I'd like to meet tomorrow. She came back to the Aldgate building in the morning. He was at the long table with maps. Actual paper maps, she noted, hand-annotated in 2 colors of pen. And 2 other people she hadn't met. A woman in her 30s with the compact, deliberate physicality of someone who had trained extensively in things Selene preferred not to think about, named Kael, and a pale, thin man with restless hands who handled Lucian's financial intelligence and introduced himself only as Porter. The meeting was dense and specific and lasted 4 hours. And by the end of it, Selene had a complete picture of what Damien had been building for the past 3 years. Not just the fraud in the affair, but the systematic cultivation of political connections, the leveraging of Cross Veyne's corporate weight to gain influence in city regulatory processes, the long game of a man positioning himself for something larger than just money, mayoral ambition. She hadn't known. She should have known. He's been planning this for longer than the company was even successful, she said, to no one in particular, sitting with the documentation spread across the table in front of her. He married into the company, Lucian said. He was across the table watching her read. He needed the platform, not the partnership. He needed me to build it, she said. And then he needed me gone before I could see what he was building with it. The room was quiet. The car accident, she said. That was because I was getting close to something. Lucian's eyes moved to Porter, who opened a file. 8 weeks before the board meeting, you requested an internal audit of the Asia-Pacific Division subcontractor billing structure. We had cost overruns that didn't match the project scope. The subcontractor billing was where Damien's laundering pipeline was running, Porter said. Your audit request would have surfaced it within 3 billing cycles. She stared at the file. So they accelerated the frame and tried to soften you up first. Lucien's voice was flat. Not theatrical, just flat, the way someone states a structural fact about a building. The accident was meant to introduce doubt in your own judgment, make you second-guess your instincts at a moment when you needed them most. She thought about those 6 weeks, the disorientation after the accident, which she'd attributed to the collision itself, the minor concussion, the stress of the repair and the insurance and the general texture of a near miss. She thought about how she had, in fact, pulled back on the audit, had restructured it as a lower priority item and pushed the timeline, had told herself it could wait a quarter. They had made her do it to herself. The cold structural rage that had been living in her chest for 10 days shifted its weight. I want in, she said. All the way in, not parallel tracks. I want to see everything you have, and I want to be in the room when we decide how it moves. Lucian looked at her for a moment. That has implications, he said. I know what it has. Once you're in this room with full visibility, there's no version where you walk away clean. Your association with my operation will follow you. My association with you already follows me, she said. Damien made sure of that when he used your infrastructure to build my frame. She held his gaze. I was already in this room. I'd just like to stop pretending I'm not. Kael, across the table, made a quiet sound that might have been approval. Lucien was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. The kind of nod that functions as a signature. She stayed until evening. That night, for the first time in 10 days, she did not sleep in the hotel. She stayed in a guest room on the 4th floor of the Aldgate building, spare, clean, nothing personal in it, and lay in the dark with the city noise filtering through the thick glass, and ran through what she knew and what she was going to do with it. The Winter Sovereign Gala was in 3 weeks, the city's premier social event, the convergence point of old money and new politics, and the entire institutional architecture of Blackmere's power class. Damien would be there. Vivica would be there. Every investor, every board member, every media figure that had watched her ejection from her own company and filed it away as entertainment would be there. She had begun to form an idea, not revenge. She had been careful, in her own internal language, not to call it revenge, because revenge was about feeling, and feeling was not a reliable operational framework. This was something colder than revenge and more durable. This was the architecture of consequence. She fell asleep with the city light leaking under the curtains and her phone on the bedside table, and for the first time in a long time, no dreams. The trouble started on a Tuesday. She was in a coffee shop 2 blocks from Greta's office, working through financial documents on her laptop, when she became aware of being watched. Not the background noise awareness of urban life, people glance at each other, it means nothing, but the specific directional quality of attention that has purpose in it. She didn't look up immediately. She adjusted her posture, using the laptop screen as a low-grade reflective surface to scan the room behind her. 2 men, a table near the window, separately seated but with the body language synchrony of people trying not to look synchronized. One of them had a phone on the table, face up, angled toward her. She closed the laptop, picked up her coffee, left. They followed her onto the street. She didn't run. Running was information. She walked at a consistent pace, south on Callaway, and called Lucian. 2 on me, she said. Callaway between 9th and 10th. Keep walking south. His voice was already different, the unhurried quality stripped back to something more compressed. Porter has you on the traffic network. Don't turn onto a side street. Carver people? She asked. Possibly. A pause. Possibly Damien's own. He's been using private contractors. Helpful distinction, she said. Kyle is 4 minutes out. She kept walking. Her heart rate was elevated but not unmanageable. She noticed that about herself. The physiological fear response was present, but running below the level that impaired function, like a motor running hot but not yet overheating. She had spent enough high-stakes years in enough hostile boardrooms to have developed some version of this tolerance, though she was aware that boardrooms and wet sidewalks with men behind you were not the same category of threat. She passed a pharmacy, a dry cleaner, a deli with its morning sandwich board out. Normal Tuesday morning, Blackmere commerce completely indifferent to her. A black car pulled up alongside her. Different from Lucien's, smaller, no partition. Kyle behind the wheel. She got in without breaking stride, and the car was moving before the door was fully closed. And when she looked back through the rear window, the 2 men were standing on the sidewalk watching the car go, and one of them was already on his phone. They'll report the plate, she said. It's a clean plate, Kyle said. She drove with the same compacted stillness she brought to everything. Are you hurt? No. Good. Eyes in the mirror, brief. Lucien wants you back in Aldgate. Tell Lucien I have a meeting with my lawyer in an hour. He knows. He'll be there. She turned to look at Kyle. He'll be at my lawyer's office. Yes. Without being asked. He made the call when you got on the phone. No particular emphasis in Kyle's voice. Just fact. He makes calls like that. Selene faced forward. Outside, the city moved past in its usual indifferent beauty. The Blackmere she had grown up adjacent to and then fought her way into and then been thrown out of. She had spent the past 10 days beginning to understand that she had been living inside a structure she hadn't fully seen, and that the structure was larger and older than her marriage and her company and her ruined career. It had been built around her for years, patiently, by people who understood that the most efficient way to take something from someone was to convince them to stand still. She was done standing still. How much does Lucien know about my father? She asked. Kyle was quiet for a moment. Ask him, Kyle said. It was the particular quality of that pause, fractional but loaded, that stayed with Selene for the rest of the ride. Not the refusal to answer, the hesitation before the refusal, the gap that meant the answer existed but wasn't Kyle's to give. She was still turning it over when they pulled into the Aldgate lot, and she looked up to find Lucien already standing at the entrance, jacket on, watching the car come in with those gray-green harbor eyes, and an expression that was not quite neutral, not quite something else, and that she was beginning to learn how to read, even though she wasn't sure yet whether she should trust what she was reading. She got out of the car. "My father," she said before he could speak. His jaw shifted slightly. The only tell she had found in him so far. "Inside," he said. "Tell me now." "Selene, tell me now." He looked at her for a long moment in the morning light of the Aldgate parking lot. A delivery truck moved along the street behind him. A pigeon worked at something on the asphalt nearby. "Your father's death wasn't an accident," he said. The world didn't tilt. The sky didn't change. The pigeon kept working at whatever it had found. But something behind Selene's sternum went very still and very cold, and she understood that everything she thought she'd known about the shape of her losses was about to be dismantled and rebuilt in a form she wasn't ready for yet and couldn't. She didn't move. That was the thing she would remember later. Not the words themselves, not the exact quality of Lucian's voice when he said them, but the absolute stillness that came over her body in the moment after. Like every system had simultaneously decided to pause and verify before continuing. Her feet on the asphalt, the delivery truck completing its turn, the pigeon finding whatever it had been looking for and flying away. "Your father's death wasn't an accident." "Inside," Lucian said again. Quieter this time. Not a command. Something closer to a request. She walked past him through the entrance. She didn't remember deciding to. Her legs simply carried her, the way legs carry people through the corridors of hospitals at certain hours, the body defaulting to forward motion because it understands that stopping is not an option available to the situation. The stairwell, the second floor, the room with the harbor light. Porter was gone. Kael stayed near the door without being asked. Lucienne moved to the table and remained standing, which she understood instinctively as a choice. He was not going to sit down and make this comfortable, because making it comfortable would be a form of condescension. He was going to stand and give it to her straight and let her react however she needed to react. She stood across the table from him. "How?" she said. "His cardiac event 3 years ago." Lucian's voice was level. The pathology was consistent with natural causes. The autopsy found nothing atypical. But 18 months ago, during the investigation into Damien's network, my team pulled financial records from a shell company called Helix Meridian. He reached into the file on the table and set a document in front of her. Helix Meridian contracted a private medical consultant 2 weeks before your father was hospitalized. The consultant specializes in pharmacological interventions that don't survive standard toxicology screening. The payment was routed through a secondary holding that traces back to a trust co-managed by Damien Cross and Vivica Hale's family office. She looked at the document. The numbers and dates were very clean on the page. She registered them in the way you register information that your mind already partially knew and had been refusing to complete. "My father had a heart condition," she said. "Yes, which is why it worked." She picked up the document, set it back down, picked it up again. Her hands were doing something she didn't have full control over, a fine tremor that wasn't fear, but was the body's honest response to a weight that was too specific to be abstract. Her father, Edmund Veyne, 61 years old, dead of cardiac arrest in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and industrial floor cleaner, with Selene holding his hand and Damien standing at the foot of the bed, with his face arranged in the expression she now understood was simply the default performance setting of a man who felt nothing that wasn't tactically useful. She had grieved. She had done the full, terrible geography of grief, the first weeks of functional numbness, the intermediate months of unexpected ambush by memory, the longer, slow renegotiation with a world that had her father in it, and then didn't. She had come out the other side of it changed and recognizable and still standing, because her father had raised her to stand. And Damien had been there for all of it, holding her up, filling her water glass, answering condolence calls so she wouldn't have to, making himself indispensable in her grief with the patient efficiency of a man who had engineered that grief and needed to manage the aftermath. She set the document down. "The company," she said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears, like it was coming from a room adjacent to the one she was standing in. "My father was going to restructure the company before he died. He told me he was considering bringing in an outside auditor. A comprehensive review of the executive tier, the board composition, everything. He'd already retained the auditor, Lucien said. We found the engagement letter in Helix Meridian's files. The review was scheduled to begin 6 weeks after your father died. He paused. Damien was on the executive tier. A comprehensive review would have surfaced the early laundering pipeline before it was fully operational. So my father found something, or was about to find it. The distinction matters less than the outcome. His voice didn't soften. She appreciated that. Softness right now would have felt like being handled. Damien couldn't risk the review. Your father was the only one with the authority to commission it unilaterally, without board approval. When your father died, that authority transferred to you. But you were in grief, and Damien was the one managing your access to information, and the review never happened. The structure of it was so clean, so architecturally precise. The removal of the one person who could see clearly, timed to the moment just before he would have acted on what he saw. The management of the heir through manufactured intimacy. The years of careful positioning that followed, the patient accumulation of leverage and access and loyalty, all of it building toward a moment when Selene would be too embedded in the structure to see it was a cage. 6 years. She had spent 6 years of her life inside something that had been built to consume her. I need 10 minutes, she said. Lucien nodded. He and Kael left the room without further conversation, and she stood alone in the harbor light and put both palms flat on the surface of the table and looked at the document spread across it and breathed. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth. The technique her father had taught her when she was 9 years old and had failed a mathematics examination and sat at the kitchen table unable to stop crying. And he had sat beside her and said, "You cry when you need to, and then you breathe, and then you decide what comes next. Selene, in that order, never skip the breathing." She didn't cry. There was something in her that needed to, that had been building pressure since the lobby of the Cross-Vein building with the cameras flashing, since the hallway floor, since Vivica's face in the doorway holding her wine glass. But it couldn't find a way out right now, and she understood that was because the grief and the rage had fused into something that didn't have a simple release mechanism, something that needed to be used. She straightened up, pulled the documents together, organized them by date. Then she opened the door and told Lucien they needed to accelerate the timeline. The next 7 days moved at a pace that didn't allow for much interiority. Selene operated out of Aldgate, splitting her time between sessions with Greta on the legal architecture and sessions with Porter on the financial documentation, building 2 parallel cases that were designed to be released simultaneously, one through the courts, one through the media. The legal case needed to be airtight, every chain of evidence documented and verified, every connection between the shell corporations and the criminal activity traceable without gaps. The media case needed to be visceral and immediate, the kind of story that landed in the public consciousness like a physical impact and couldn't be managed or reframed. She was good at the media architecture. She had spent 12 years building a company's public narrative. She understood the mechanics of story the way a carpenter understands load-bearing. You didn't overwhelm people with everything at once. You gave them the shape first, the emotional core, the human betrayal, and then you layered the technical evidence in behind it, so that by the time the complexity arrived, the audience was already committed. Damien had used that against her. Now she was going to use it against him. But the 7 days also had friction in them. On the 3rd day, Porter surfaced a problem. He brought it to her directly, which she appreciated. He was not the kind of person who softened deliveries and laid it out flat. 2 of the 3 auditing firms Damien had used for the forged documentation had received significant new business in the month following the board meeting. The business came from a consortium that was at several removes connected to the Carver Syndicate, the same syndicate that Damien was now seeking protection from Lucien through. So the Carver people helped build the frame, Selene said. They facilitated the financial infrastructure. Porter's restless hands moved across the documents on the table. Which means they have skin in this. If Damien goes down, the trail leads back to them. Which means they have a reason to prevent Damien from going down. Or a reason to ensure that whatever Damien hands over in a deal doesn't include them. She stared at the documents. Does Lucien know? I'm telling you both simultaneously. Porter looked up. It's his operation, too. Lucien was at the other end of the table. He had been going through a different set of files, and she had been, in the way you develop peripheral awareness of someone when you spend long hours in the same space, consistently aware of his position and attention without looking directly at him. She looked at him now. Carver moving against you isn't new, she said. The timeline is new. His voice was even. If they're protecting their investment in Damien's frame, they'll want to move before the gala, before we have a platform. He looked at Porter. Get Ren in from the Eastern Post and pull everyone off the harbor watch. I need that manpower on building security. Porter nodded and left. Cale was already on her phone in the corner. Selene looked at the accelerating logistics of something that was beginning to feel less like a plan and more like a controlled emergency. How serious is the Carver threat? Serious enough. He set down the file he'd been holding. They've hit 3 of my operations in the past 6 weeks. Nothing catastrophic. They're testing responses, mapping reaction times. His jaw shifted. They think you're a liability I haven't fully assessed. They want to use me to get to you. They want to use the situation. A brief pause. You being publicly associated with me creates pressure points. It gives them leverage they can use to force my hand on territory questions. So I'm useful to them as a weapon. You're useful to them as a distraction. He looked at her directly. Which is why I want you in this building at night. I can cover the perimeter. I can't cover a hotel room in the harbor district at the same time. She held his gaze for a moment. You've been covering the hotel since the first night. She thought about the black car in the parking lot, 3 days of it before she'd gotten in. The driver who unlocked the rear door without being asked. The note under the door that she'd read as a message and was now understanding was also something more practical. Proof of access. Proof of proximity, a way of saying I am close enough to protect you without saying it directly, to a woman who would have refused direct protection before she understood why she needed it. She filed that away and didn't comment on it. Fine, she said. On the 5th day, the first warehouse burned. She heard it from Kyle at 3 a.m. A Draven-owned cold storage facility in the Eastport district, clean arson, professional accelerant placement that the fire investigator would later describe as the work of someone who understood fire as a tool rather than a statement. No casualties, the facility had been closed for the night, but the message was unambiguous. The Carver people were no longer testing response times. Lucien took the call in the hallway outside her room. She heard his voice through the door. Not the words, just the quality of it, the particular compression of a man absorbing operational damage and converting it immediately to tactical response without passing through anger as an intermediate step. She had heard anger in him only once, briefly, when Porter had made an error in a financial calculation that had cost them a week's work, and it had been cold and short and completely without theatrics, the kind of anger that was worse than shouting because it had no outlet and no end. She lay in the dark and listened to the muffled logistics of his voice in the hallway, and thought about her father, and thought about the gala, now 13 days away, and thought about the geometry of what was converging. The 6th day brought something she hadn't anticipated. Vivica called. She used a number Selene didn't recognize. Not her personal cell, which Selene had blocked, but a number that came up as a Blackmere area code with no attached name. Selene almost didn't answer. She was in the middle of a documentation review with Greta, and her instinct was to let it go to voicemail and deal with it later. But something about the pattern of the call, it rang, stopped, rang again immediately, the way people call when they know you're there and they're making a point of insistence, made her pick up. Don't hang up, Vivica said. Her voice sounded different. The particular social gloss that Selene had known for 8 years, the warmth that was always slightly too calibrated to be entirely artless, was gone. What was left underneath it was something rawer and less composed. Talk, Selene said. I need to see you. No. Selene. Vivica, she kept her voice flat. You helped frame me for fraud. You helped cover up my father's murder. I don't have a conversation to have with you. A pause, and then, in a voice that was quieter than anything Selene had heard from her in 8 years of friendship. I didn't know about Edmund. Selene was quiet. I need you to know that, Vivica said. I knew about the frame. I helped with the board documentation. I had access to the auditing firms through my family trust, and Damien needed the infrastructure. I knew that. Her breath was audible on the line, unsteady in a way that Selene noted and filed without yet deciding what to do with. I did not know about your father. I did not know that was what I was helping enable. I didn't find out until a stop. Something that might have been a swallowed sound. I found out 4 months ago. I found files on Damien's private server. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it. What you should have done, Selene said, was call me 4 months ago. I know. Or a year ago. Or the night you got into bed with my husband and decided that was acceptable. I know. Quieter. So what do you want, Vivica? What is this call? I have the files. Her voice firmed slightly, the way a voice firms when it finds something solid to stand on. Everything on Damien's server, the Helix Meridian contracts, the consultant payments, the communication chain. I copied everything before he could access that he'd been breached. A pause. I want to give it to you. Greta, across the table, was watching Selene with the focused expression of someone reading a situation in real time. Selene covered the phone. Can you trace the location of a call in progress? She asked. Greta was already on her own phone. Selene uncovered hers. Why are you coming to me now? Because he found out, I know. Vivica's voice dropped. 3 days ago. I don't know how. He has someone in my household. I think it's the housekeeper. She's been with the family trust for 2 years, and I should have checked the reference more carefully. But I didn't. The controlled surface of her voice was developing fractures, like a glaze starting to crack under heat. He told me yesterday that if I spoke to anyone about what I found, the fraud documentation from the board meeting would be amended to show that I was the primary architect of the frame, not him. He has the same infrastructure. He can do it. My name goes on it instead of yours, and he walks clean. So you're not coming to me because it's right, Selene said. You're coming to me because you're scared. Both things can be true. It was the most honest thing Vivica had said in the entire conversation. Maybe in years. Greta wrote a location on a notepad and slid it across the table. Selene looked at it. A coffee shop in the Meridian district 4 blocks from Vivica's apartment. There's a place called Caro's on Meridian and 6th, Selene said. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. Come alone. If I see anyone I don't expect, I leave. She hung up before Vivica could respond. She looked at Greta. Do we trust it? Greta asked. No, Selene said. But we verify it. If those files exist and she has them, it changes the timeline on everything. It could be a setup. It could be. Damien could have found out about the gala plan, or part of it, and sent Vivica to draw me into a meeting. She stood and moved to the window, the Aldgate rooftops in the late afternoon. But Vivica has never been good at performing fear she doesn't feel. And what I heard on that call, she paused. She's scared. It's real. Scared people are manageable, Greta said. But scared people are also unstable. I know. Selene turned. Which is why I need to get her out of Damien's reach before the meeting. If she spends tonight in proximity to him, he may find a different way to ensure her silence. She called Lucien. Demant. He was not pleased about the meeting. She had anticipated that. His displeasure was not theatrical. He didn't raise his voice or pace or deploy the kind of body language that men use when they want a woman to understand they're serious. He stood in the doorway of the second-floor room at Aldgate and listened to her lay out the call, and then he was quiet for a moment with his arms crossed and his jaw at that angle she had begun to associate with suppressed operational concern. Vivica Hale has been in Damien's architecture for 14 months, he said. She is a direct participant in your frame and a potential witness to your father's murder. She is also frightened and therefore unpredictable. Meeting her in a public location without security infrastructure. I'll have Kael, Selene said. Kael is one person. I know what Kael is. She'll be enough. She held his gaze. Lucien, if those files are real, if Vivica has the full Helix Meridian chain, we don't need to wait for the gala. We have everything we need to take this to the federal contact tomorrow. The gala becomes a public confirmation of a collapse that's already in progress, not a gamble on a single event. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched him work through the operational calculus, the risk assessment, the resource allocation, the particular arithmetic of a man who had learned to measure everything in terms of what he could and couldn't control. "You meet her at 8, he said. "Kyle runs the perimeter from arrival. You leave if anything reads wrong. Anything. Agreed. And you wear this." He moved to the table and picked up what looked, at first glance, like a small piece of jewelry, a pendant on a thin chain, understated, the kind of thing that didn't look like anything. He held it out to her. She looked at it in his hand. "Tracker." "And Mike. Short range, but Kyle will be close enough." She took it. Their fingers didn't touch in the exchange, but the proximity was close enough that she was aware of the warmth of his hand, and she was aware of being aware of it, and she put both those things in the part of her mind that was currently under a temporary moratorium. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. Then, as she turned to go, "Selene." She looked back. "When this is over," he said, and then stopped. Started again differently. "Your father knew what he was doing when he built that company. What he was actually doing. He wasn't just building a business." She waited. "He was trying to build something that couldn't be taken from you," Lucian said. He'd seen what people like Damien do. He'd dealt with them in his early years. There are files from before you were involved in the company, before you even came in, from when your father was running it alone. He had a run-in with the Carver operation in the early years. He got out cleanly, but he understood the landscape. A pause. "He built the compliance protocols you mentioned to the board, the secondary authorization requirements. He built those specifically to protect you, specifically because he knew you would be running it one day, and he knew what you'd be walking into." She stood very still. "He saw it coming," she said. "Not Damien specifically, but something like it." Lucian's voice was steady but not impersonal. There was something in it she couldn't classify. He was trying to protect you from a threat he couldn't fully identify yet. And Damien saw the protections and understood that the fastest way through them was to make you trust him before he activated. She looked at the pendant in her hand, the thin chain pooled in her palm. "My father was a careful man," she said. Her voice was steady, but only because she was holding it that way with both hands internally. He wasn't cynical, he just paid attention. "Yes," Lucian said quietly. She put the pendant on. It sat at the base of her throat, light and cool against her skin. She went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and finally, let herself cry. Not the broken weeping of someone without options, but the hard, brief, essential grief of someone who loved a person who was gone and who had just understood the full shape of how they'd been taken. It lasted 4 minutes. She timed it without meaning to, because that was the kind of person she was. And when it was done, she washed her face and sat in the chair by the window and looked at Blackmere's nighttime silhouette and began preparing for the morning. She arrived at Caro's at 7:52. Kyle was already embedded, at a table near the far wall with a newspaper and a coffee, visible to Selene and invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for her. The coffee shop was a neighborhood place, worn wooden floors and the smell of something baked from actual scratch, a handful of regulars working through their morning routines, not the kind of place that attracted attention. Vivica came in at 8:03. She looked reduced. That was the word that came to Selene. Not tired, not disheveled, though there was some of both, but reduced, the way a person looks when the architecture they've been hiding inside collapses, and what's left is just the person without the structure. She was in a dark coat and no makeup, and her hair pulled back, and she stopped when she saw Selene and did the thing with her face that Selene had watched her do in 100 high-stress social situations. The rapid reorganization, the assembly of composure from whatever materials were available. But there wasn't enough material right now, and they both knew it. She sat down. Selene put a coffee cup in front of her, poured from the carafe she'd ordered, and said nothing. Vivica wrapped both hands around the cup. "You look—" "Don't," Selene said. "Not today." Vivica closed her mouth. "The files," Selene said. "Show me." Vivica reached into her bag and set an encrypted drive on the table between them, black, unmarked, the size of a thumb. Everything from the private server, the Helix Meridian contracts, the consultant payment chain, the communication logs between Damien and a man named Gregor Sell. He's the one who handled the medical side. There's also... She paused. There are communications between Damien and someone inside the Carver operation. Specific communications. About you. About me. About what to do with you after the gala. Vivica's hands tightened around the coffee cup. He's not planning to let the mayoral campaign speak for itself. He needs you permanently. He used the word resolved. He has someone in the Carver network who handles... She stopped. Resolutions. The coffee shop ambient noise continued around them. A child at a nearby table was asking about something and his mother was explaining it patiently. A man at the counter was reading his phone. So the gala isn't just his platform, Selene said slowly. It's also his timeline. If you're still alive and fighting him when he announces the campaign, the story becomes about the controversy, not the candidate. He needs you neutralized before the announcement. Vivica looked directly at her for the first time. Selene, he's been planning this for 3 years. Everything, the frame, the financial destruction, all of it, was designed to leave you with no resources and no credibility, so that when he moved against you finally, no one would look too closely. But I got resources, Selene said. Her voice was flat. He knows. Vivica's jaw tightened. He knows about Draven. He has a source somewhere. I don't know where. He knows you're working with him and he's been using it. He's been feeding selective information to 2 separate media contacts framing you as a Mafia associate. The story is already being written. When it drops, when does it drop? He has it timed for the week before the gala. He wants you publicly associated with organized crime before you can make any move. It destroys your credibility as a witness to anything. Everything you've built with Greta, every document, every chain of evidence, it becomes tainted by association. She looked down at her coffee. And it gives him the justification in certain circles for whatever comes after. The coffee shop. The morning light. The child explaining something to his mother with great seriousness. Selene picked up the drive and turned it between her fingers. The media story drops before the gala. Damien's Carver contact resolves the problem during or after. Everything she had spent 3 weeks building, the legal case, the documentation, the parallel tracks with Lucian, had already been anticipated, and the counter had been positioned before she had even walked into the Aldgate building for the first time. "Who's his source?" she said. Vivica was quiet. "Vivica, I don't know for certain. Who do you think?" A pause. Long enough that Selene's chest began to tighten in a specific and very targeted way, because she was already calculating the limited number of people who had known about her arrangement with Lucian before the media story was constructed, and the arithmetic was producing an answer she didn't want. "Porter," Vivica said. "His real name is Callum Weiss. He's been on the Carver payroll for 6 years. I found his name in one of the communication logs." She looked up. "He's been inside Draven's operation for 6 years, Selene. Everything you've said in that building, every plan you've made, every piece of documentation you've assembled." The door of the coffee shop opened. 4 men came in. Not regulars, not morning commuters. The quality of their entrance, the way they distributed themselves immediately, 2 toward the back, 1 near the door, 1 moving directly towards Selene's table, was the quality of people executing a pre-planned geometry. Kael was already moving, rising from her table, hand inside her jacket. Selene stood up. The drive was in her pocket. Her heart rate had spiked and she could feel her pulse in her temples and the specific terrible clarity of a situation that had already been decided before she walked into it was settling over her like something cold poured from a height. Vivica had not moved. She sat with her hands around her coffee cup and her face arranged in an expression that Selene could not read for exactly 1 second, and then could read completely, and the reading of it was the worst thing she had experienced in 3 weeks of worse things. Not fear. Vivica's face, when Selene looked at it properly, did not contain fear. It contained the specific, familiar cast of a person who had made a decision and was watching it execute. "Vivica," Selene said, very quietly. "I'm sorry," Vivica said. And she sounded as if she meant it, which was the part that Kael moved first. She came across the coffee shop floor in 3 strides and put herself between Selene and the man walking toward their table, and the collision that followed was brief and completely without theatrical quality. Kael's elbow into his throat, her left hand catching his wrist before he could reach inside his jacket, a controlled takedown that put him against the nearest table hard enough to send cups sliding. The 2 customers closest to the impact scrambled back. Someone screamed once, short and sharp, and then the coffee shop became the particular kind of silent that happens when a room full of people simultaneously decides to stop breathing. Selene was already moving. She did not move toward the exit. She moved toward Vivica. She grabbed Vivica's wrist across the table and pulled her half out of her chair, close enough that there was no social distance left, no managed expression possible, just 2 faces and the raw material of what was between them. "The drive," Selene said. "Is it real?" Vivica's face was doing something complicated. The composed arrangement had fractured fully now. "Yes." "Is everything on it real?" "Yes. I told you the truth." "You also set me up." "He was going to kill me." Her voice broke on the last word, not dramatically, but the way a physical structure breaks. A clean snap under load. "He found out 4 days ago that I'd copied the files. He sent someone to my apartment, not to threaten me, to demonstrate. They hurt my housekeeper, Selene. She's 63 years old. They put her in the hospital to show me what the next step was." The man near the door was watching Kael manage his colleague, calculating. The 2 at the back were still positioned. This was not a violent extraction. Not yet. This was a message, a demonstration of access. The same technique Damien apparently applied to problems that needed managing without final resolution. Because Damien still needed Selene alive. For now. For whatever came after the gala needed a body to point to. "So you called me," Selene said, "and told me the truth, and brought them with you." "He said call you in, give you the drive, let them see where you went after. He doesn't know where you're operating from. He needed—" Vivica swallowed. "He needed me to lead them to the building." Selene let go of her wrist. She pulled the drive from her pocket, looked at it once, and put it back. "Kael," she said, "working on it." Kael had the first man's phone and was moving toward the back of the shop. The man near the door made his decision. He stepped forward and Selene did something she had never done before in her adult life. She picked up the ceramic coffee carafe from the table and threw it directly at him. Not a warning throw, a committed throw. The kind you make when you've accepted the consequence and just want to create 3 seconds of disorientation. And the carafe hit him in the shoulder and shattered, and the remaining coffee went across his face, and he recoiled, and those 3 seconds were enough. Kael had the back door open. They went through it, Selene, Kael, and Vivica, because Selene had made the calculation between the door and the back of the shop that Vivica's testimony and the files on the drive were worth more than her fury, and she would process the fury later. Into an alley that smelled like restaurant waste and wet concrete, and Kael was on her phone before the door closed behind them. "We're compromised," Kael said into the phone. "Caro's. I need the Meridian pickup now." The alley ran east. They ran east. Selene's shoes were wrong for this. Low heels, not high, but not flat, and the cobblestone surface of the older section of Meridian District Alley was uneven in the way of things that were never designed for the use being made of them. She hit a seam wrong and felt her left ankle turn, not badly, not a break, but enough to send a white flare of pain up her leg that she absorbed and converted and kept moving through because the alternative to moving was not available. Behind them, the coffee shop door opened. Kael looked back once. 2. Fast? Fast enough? They came out of the alley onto a side street and a black car was already there. Different from any Selene had been in before. Lower and faster looking. A driver she didn't recognize. She got in. Kael pushed Vivica in behind her and came in last, and the car was moving before the door locked. Selene looked through the rear window. The 2 men came out of the alley mouth and stopped. One of them was on a phone. They had the plate. They had the direction. "They'll track us," she said. "For about 6 blocks, the driver said. He had a Blackmere accent, flat and northern. "Then we swap." The swap happened in an underground parking structure on Callaway. A second car waiting in a prearranged spot, keys in the ignition, The first car left dark in the structure. 3 minutes total. Selene registered it as the kind of logistics that required preparation. And preparation required knowing the coffee shop meeting was compromised before the coffee shop meeting happened. And that meant... She looked at Kael. Lucien knew, she said. He suspected, Kael said, since last night. Porter, Weiss, made a call at 11 p.m. that didn't route through any of our communication channels. Lucien flagged it. He didn't have confirmation until this morning. So he set up the extraction before I went in. He set it up as a contingency. Kael looked at her steadily. He didn't tell you because you needed Vivica to believe the meeting was unprotected. If you'd walked in there knowing about the backup, your posture would have been different. Selena sat with that for a moment. The second car smelled like something clean and synthetic, like new upholstery. Vivica was in the far corner of the back seat, arms wrapped around herself, looking at nothing. She had been used as a prop in 2 simultaneous operations, Damien's and Lucien's, and had walked into the coffee shop believing she was the one doing the using. She identified the particular humiliation of that and set it aside because there was no productive use for it right now. Porter, she said, where is he? Aldgate, Kael said. Lucien is handling it. The quality of those 3 words, Lucien is handling it, was something Selene chose not to examine too specifically. They came into the Aldgate building through the loading bay, and Selene heard the voices before she reached the second floor. Lucien's voice, low and controlled, with the compression she'd learned to read as maximum constraint applied to something that wanted to go in a different direction. Another voice, higher, faster, with the particular pitch of someone who has tried several angles and found all of them closing. Porter. Weiss. Whatever his name was. She came through the door. He was seated at the long table, both hands flat on the surface, with Ren, the man Lucien had called in from the Eastern Post, broad and quiet, and with the kind of face that had seen most categories of situation, standing behind him. Lucien was on the other side of the table, standing, jacket off, in the precise posture she associated with him when he was operating from absolute stillness rather than comfort. Porter looked at Selene when she came in. Something moved across his face. Not guilt, she noted, or not guilt primarily. Something more like the expression of a man who has been calculating odds and has just watched one of the variables resolve in a way he hadn't fully accounted for. You're alive, he said. It might have been relief, or might have been something more complex. Disappoint you? She said. No. He looked back at Lucien. I told you, I wasn't trying to get her killed. You fed her location to a Carver operative, Lucien said. His voice was very even. I fed a location to someone who told me they needed to confirm she was still in Blackmere for a financial arrangement. I didn't know... Stop. Lucien's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You've been on the Carver payroll for 6 years. You've had access to every operational decision I've made for 6 years. Don't tell me about what you did or didn't know. Porter's hands pressed harder against the table. I kept you alive. Twice, in the last 18 months, I had information from the Carver side that I fed back to you, operations that would have gone badly. I was managing both sides. And when managing both sides required choosing, Lucien said, you chose the side that paid more. I chose the side that was going to win. His voice had something desperate and honest in it now, the quality of a man making his final argument. Lucien, the Carver operation has 50% more operational volume than yours. They have federal protection you don't have. They have political infrastructure. They have Damien Cross, Lucien said, who is going to federal prison. Not if the story drops. Not if Selene is discredited. The story won't drop. Lucien looked at him for a long, still moment. Because you are going to call your Carver contact right now and tell them the meeting at Caro's resulted in Selene Veyne leaving the city. You're going to tell them the drive was recovered and destroyed, and you are going to tell them that Draven's operation is no longer a factor in the Cross situation. Porter stared at him. And if I don't? Then Ren drives you to the federal field office and you explain your 6 years of dual employment to people whose interest in the details will be more extensive than mine. The room was very quiet. Selene stood near the door and watched Porter do the arithmetic, the specific, visible arithmetic of a man with no good options arranging them in order of least damage. His hands on the table, the slight movement of his jaw, the decision landing in his eyes before he'd fully committed to it. He picked up his phone. He made the call. His voice was steady. He said what Lucien had told him to say, and he said it in the register of a man delivering routine operational information, and when he hung up, he set the phone on the table and looked at his hands. "You'll want me out of Blackmere," he said. "I want you in a room in this building until after the gala," Lucien said. "After that, yes. Out of Blackmere." Porter nodded once. Wren touched his shoulder, and he stood and they left the room. Selene let out a breath she had been holding since the coffee shop. Her ankle was throbbing with a steady insistence that she'd been successfully ignoring and could no longer fully suppress. She moved to a chair and sat in it and pressed her thumb into the muscle above the joint, not because it helped, but because it gave the pain somewhere to go. Lucien looked at her, his eyes moved to her ankle. "How bad?" "Sprained, maybe. It'll hold." She met his gaze. "We've lost the element of surprise on the gala. Damien knows I'm still operational. He'll accelerate whatever he's planning." "He already has." Lucien moved to the table and opened a laptop. "Kael sent me something on the drive over." He turned the screen toward her. It was a media monitoring alert. 3 separate entertainment and financial news feeds, timestamped 40 minutes ago. The headlines were variations on a theme. Fallen executive Selene Veyne linked to Draven crime organization. Sources claim cross-vein fraud, suspect operating inside Mafia network. Exclusive, the Blackmere crime boss and the corporate criminal, inside an unlikely alliance. They were not the full story. They were the prelude, Betrayal, the positioning pieces, dropped early to begin shaping perception before the comprehensive expose landed. 3 days, she estimated, before the full version hit. Maybe less, now that Damien knew his coffee shop operation had failed. She read the headlines twice. Let herself feel the specific targeted quality of it. The way her name sat in those sentences, the way the framing worked, the precise rhetorical construction that made her the story and Lucien the context, that made her into someone who had not been destroyed by corruption but had instead run toward it. Then she closed the laptop. "We move the gala operation to tomorrow night," she said. Lucien looked at her. "The gala is in 4 days," he said. "Damien thinks he has 4 days. We don't give him 4 days." She sat forward. "The media story needs 48 hours to establish. He drops it tonight or tomorrow, and by the time the full piece runs, we're already too contaminated to use what we have. We need to move before the story lands. We hit the gala circuit. Not the Winter Sovereign. We don't have access to that yet. But the Aldane Foundation dinner's tomorrow night. Same crowd, same investors, same board members." She looked at him steadily. "I know the Aldane Foundation. I co-chaired their annual campaign for 4 years. I can get us in." "With what objective?" "A preview." Her voice was flat and certain. "Not the full exposure. We saved the documentation for the Winter Sovereign, where there are cameras and federal observers and political press. But tomorrow night, in front of every investor and board member who watched me get walked out of my own company, I walk back in on your arm and I let them see that I am not buried and not discredited and not gone. I control the first image. I control the narrative frame before his story drops." She paused. "And I used the dinner to make 3 specific contacts. Marcus fell from my board, a federal financial crimes investigator named Diana Cho who attends every year, and a media editor named Harlow Reed who owes me a story. I plant seeds. By the time the hit piece lands, there's already a counter-narrative growing." The room was quiet for a moment. "The Winter Sovereign is still the main event," she said, "but tomorrow buys us time and repositions me. Right now I'm reactive. I need to be seen." Lucien was quiet for a long moment. She watched him turn it over. The security implications, the logistics, the risk calculus of a public appearance before the operation was fully set. "The Aldane dinner has a guest list of 300, he said. "Open bar, working press in the lobby. Security is event staff, not professional." "I know." "Damien will have someone there." "I know that too." "And you still want to walk in?" "I want to walk in something that costs more than everything he's taken from me," she said. "And I want every person in that room to see it. Yes." Something moved in Lucien's face. Not quite a smile, something that had the structure of respect. "Kael," he said. Kael in the doorway was already nodding. Bassem. The Aldane Foundation dinner occupied the grand salle of the Meridian Hotel. 3,000 square feet of ivory and gold, the kind of ballroom that had hosted 40 years of Blackmere's self-congratulation and knew how to make wealth feel inevitable. Selene had attended 11 consecutive years as a donor, a committee member, a co-chair. She knew the layout and the staff and the particular social topography of the room, who stood where, who avoided whom, which corners held the conversations that actually mattered versus the ones that were purely decorative. She had not been back since the board meeting. She wore red, not the calculated red of someone making a statement about statements, the particular deep red of someone who was done performing diminishment. The dress had been sourced in 4 hours by Kael through channels Selene didn't ask about, floor-length silk with a structure that moved with her body rather than against it, and she stood in front of the mirror in the fourth-floor room at Aldgate and looked at the woman looking back and understood that she didn't fully recognize her yet, and that was not a bad thing. Lucien knocked at 7:15. He was in black. Of course he was, she thought. He was always in black, but this was black that had been constructed with a specific intentionality, the jacket cut precisely. No tie. A quality of formality without performance that was more effective than any amount of decoration. He looked at her in the doorway without speaking for a moment. "Ready," he said. It was not quite a question. "Since 3 weeks ago," she said. The car took them south along the harbor road, the city glittering on both sides, and Selene sat with her hands loose in her lap and ran the evening's operational sequence one more time in her mind. The 3 contacts, the order of approach, what she would say to Marcus Fell, who was guilty of cowardice rather than malice and could be worked with. What she would say to Diana Cho, who she had never met but had researched exhaustively and understood to be the kind of federal investigator who was moved by evidence presented with precision, not emotion. What she would say to Harlow Reed, who she had known for 7 years, and who would smell the story before she finished the first sentence. She was not nervous. She was something past nervousness, in the particular territory that lies on the other side of it, when the fear has been fully metabolized and what's left is just the work. "Your ankle," Lucy Cien said. "What about it?" "You'll be on it for 3 hours. I'm aware. I'm just noting it," she said. "I know." She looked at him. "I'll be fine." He looked out the window. The harbor lights tracked across his face. "After tonight," he said, "it gets harder to contain. Whatever we've managed to keep internal, the federal contact, the documentation, Damien will know we're moving faster than he planned. He'll make harder moves." "I know." "The Carver contact he's using for the resolution." He paused on the word with the same flat neutrality he brought to operational facts that had personal weight. "I have a name now. We're tracking him, but tracking isn't the same as stopping." She turned to look at him. The car moved through the tunnel under the harbor channel, and the light changed, went amber and intermittent, and in that light his face was very plain. No performance, no architecture, just a man telling her something true. "Are you telling me you're scared?" she said. A pause, longer than most of his pauses. "I'm telling you I don't want you in a position where I can't get to you in time," he said. "That is a different thing." The tunnel ended. City light returned. She looked at his hands, at the way the right thumb was pressing into the left palm. The tell she'd found on their first morning in the Aldgate room, the gesture he made when he was holding himself still against something that wanted movement. She put her hand over his. He went very still. Not the practiced stillness. The other kind. "Then stay close," she said. He turned his hand and held hers, and they sat that way for the remaining 4 minutes until the car reached the Meridian Hotel, and the doorman opened the car door, and the photographer at the hotel entrance turned toward the sound of the door and raised his camera, and the flash went off, and Selene Veyne stepped out of the car with Lucien Draven's hand in hers and looked directly into the light. The ballroom went quiet by increments. It started near the entrance, the small, reflexive silence of people recognizing something unexpected, and traveled outward in a wave. The way disruption moves through a formal gathering, absorbed and re-emitted by each cluster of guests, until it had reached every corner of the Grand Salle. By the time Selene and Lucien had moved 12 feet past the entrance, the ambient social noise had dropped to a register that was technically still conversation, but was functionally something else. She felt every eye in the room. She walked like she'd never left. Marcus Fell was at the East Bar. She saw him before he saw her, and she took a moment to read him. The slightly sunken posture of a man who had attended this dinner for 30 years and was currently wishing he was somewhere else. The glass held lower than it should be, the particular arrangement of a guilty conscience in an evening jacket. When he turned and saw her, the glass dropped another 2 inches. She walked toward him. "Selene." His voice had the texture of a man swallowing several things at once. "Marcus." She stopped 3 feet away, close enough to be unambiguously intentional. "You look like you were expecting me." He glanced past her at Lucien, and she watched him do the identification, watched the name land behind his eyes. "I heard you'd left the city." "I heard that too," she said. It wasn't accurate. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. "I need 15 minutes of your time tonight, not here. There's a service corridor past the west alcove." She held his gaze. "I have documentation I'd like you to look at. You've known this company for 30 years. I'd like you to tell me if what you see surprises you." His jaw worked. "Selene, if this is about the board—" "It's about my father," she said. He went completely still. 15 minutes, she said. "When you're ready." She moved on. Diana Cho was near the foundation display, a compact woman in her late 40s in a charcoal suit who stood in the way of someone who had been trained to be comfortable in formal settings without ever fully relaxing in them. She watched Selene approach with the particular quality of attention of someone who has been briefed and is now conducting their own assessment. Selene had not been briefed on Cho, but Cho had clearly been briefed on her. "Ms. Veyne," Cho said. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement. "Ms. Cho." Selene held out a card, not a business card. Those days were suspended, but a plain card with a number on it. "I'd like to schedule 20 minutes with you in the next 48 hours. I have a documentation package that is relevant to a financial crimes investigation your office has been building for the past 18 months. A pause. "I believe we have overlapping interests." Cho took the card, looked at it. "Should I ask how you know about our investigation?" "You can ask. I'll explain everything in the meeting." Selene met her eyes. "I'd move quickly on the meeting." She left Cho turning the card in her hand and moved toward the third contact, and that was when she saw Damien. He was across the room, near the foundation stage, in conversation with 2 men she recognized as city council members. He had not seen her yet. He was in his working posture. The slight forward lean, the attentive expression, the performance of a man building something. And he looked exactly as he always had. Clean, engineered, completely without visible damage. She stopped walking. Her pulse did something she noted and managed. Beside her, Lucien had gone very still. Not tense, still. She could feel the difference. "He wasn't on the guest list," she said quietly. "He wasn't on the published list." Lucien's voice was barely above her register. "He has a donor relationship with one of the foundation board members. Walk-in addition. He knows we're here. He knew before we arrived." A pause. The photographer at the entrance. The flash. She processed that. The photo would already be circulating. The arrival image, her and Lucien, his hand in hers, was already loose in the city's information bloodstream, already doing the work of repositioning and reframing she had planned it to do. And Damien had seen it and walked into this room anyway, which meant he had decided to change the terrain. Across the ballroom, Damien Cross turned his head. He found her the way people find each other in rooms they both know, without searching, as if the coordinates were preloaded. He looked at her across 300 guests and 10 years, and everything that had been built and destroyed between them. He smiled, not warm, not theatrical, the smile of someone who has made a calculation and is comfortable with the result. Then he said something to the city council members, excused himself, and began walking toward her. Lucien moved slightly, barely perceptibly, and she touched his arm. "Stay," she said. "Selene." "I need to hear what he says." She looked at him briefly. "Stay close. Not here." He held still for precisely 1 second, the cost of that stillness visible in the set of his jaw, and then took 2 steps back and angled himself toward the bar, close enough, positioned toward the room, and she turned to face Damien as he arrived. He stopped 2 feet from her, closer than was socially conventional for the situation they were in. It was deliberate. He used space the way he used everything, as a form of communication that bypassed consent. "You look well," he said. His voice was the same practiced warmth and engineered precision, exactly as it had been every day of 6 years she had believed was a marriage. "You look nervous," she said. Something tightened very slightly around his eyes. "I'm not nervous, Selene. He glanced at the space where Lucien had been, found him at the bar, returned. "Concerned. About what you're doing." "Which part?" "All of it." He lowered his voice. Not from privacy, the ambient noise of 300 people covered conversation thoroughly, but from the habit of making his most significant statements feel confidential. "You've put yourself in a position with someone who will use you and discard you when the utility is gone. I've seen him do it." "Have you?" "I know his operation better than you think." "I know," she said. "You laundered money through it." His jaw moved. "Selene, whatever you think you have, I have everything," she said. Flat, certain, not performed. The Helix Meridian contracts, the consultant payments, the communication logs, the full chain between your operation and the Carver network. She watched his face. "And I have your communication about the resolution you've contracted for after the gala." For the first time, she saw something in his face that was not managed, a fracture, hairline, in the engineered surface. It lasted less than a second and then the surface reformed, but she had seen it and they both knew it. "You should walk away," he said, quietly, "while you still have options." I don't have a walkaway option," she said. "I haven't had one since the night you had my father killed, which I think you know, which is why the resolution is on contract." She held his gaze. "The only question now is who finishes this first." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said very quietly, in a voice that finally dropped all the architecture and was just the flat operational voice of what he actually was. "You can't win this, Selene, even with everything you have. I'll be on that stage at the Winter Sovereign in 4 days, and I will announce my campaign, and by the time any evidence surfaces, I will have enough political protection that nothing you produce will—" Something happened. A sound. Not loud, not close, but specific. The controlled concussive sound of something load-bearing giving way, somewhere above or behind, and then the lights in the grand salle went out. Total darkness. 300 voices in collective shock. And then the emergency systems tripped and the red backup lighting came on, painting the entire ballroom in the color of something that had already happened, and Selene turned because she needed to find Lucien and couldn't immediately. And then someone grabbed her arm from behind. And it was not Lucien. The hand was wrong, the grip was wrong, and she had exactly half a second to understand that the darkness had been operational before everything accelerated into— The hand on her arm was pulling her backward. Not violently. That was the disorienting part. It was the controlled, purposeful grip of someone who had done this before, who understood that force used correctly doesn't need to announce itself. She was being moved through the red-lit dark of the grand salle, through the press of 300 confused bodies, toward the service corridor she had pointed out to Marcus Fell an hour ago. She planted her left foot and dropped her weight and drove her elbow back hard. It connected. The grip loosened by exactly enough. She turned. A man she didn't recognize, broad through the chest, in a server's jacket that didn't fit him correctly across the shoulders. He recovered fast, faster than she'd hoped, and reached for her again, and then someone stepped into the gap between them, and the man went down in a way that removed him entirely from the equation. Kael. "Move," Kael said. "Lucien. On your left. Move." Lucien was there, materializing from the red-saturated dark the way he always seemed to occupy space, as though he'd been in it before he arrived. He took her arm, not the grip of the man on the floor, nothing like that. Just his hand under her elbow with a steadiness that was the opposite of violence, even though she could feel the tension running through him like current through a wire. Exit, he said. Now. Not yet. She pulled against his hand. Not hard. Enough to be clear. Where's Damien? Selene. Where is he? She found him herself. He was near the stage, 15 feet away, his composure finally broken. Not dramatically, not the movie version of a man unraveling, just the real version, which was a man in an expensive jacket with slightly too much stillness in his body and his eyes moving in a way that was calculating exits. His phone was in his hand. He was making or receiving a call. The backup lighting was doing something to the room. The red quality of it, the way it flattened shadow and detail into a single register, that made everything feel more essential, more real. 300 people in formal wear and emergency light, and the room had stopped being a social event and become something older and more honest. Selene walked toward him. Lucien came with her. He did not try to stop her again. Damien saw her coming when she was 8 feet away. He ended his call. He looked at her with the face she had been studying for weeks now, the face behind the face, and what was in it was not fear yet. It was something that was deciding whether to become fear. It's over, she said. She stopped 4 feet from him. The Carver contact you called. Ren has been on his location for 6 hours. He's not coming. His jaw tightened. You don't have... Diana Cho is in this building, Selene said. She came tonight because I asked her to. The documentation package went to her office 40 minutes ago. Greta sent it the moment the lights went out because the lights going out was the contingency signal we'd agreed on if Damien Cross was present and operational. She watched his face. The federal warrant for your financial records was filed this afternoon. The Helix Meridian chain, the consultant payments, the communication logs, all of it is already in federal custody. Something moved behind his eyes. The calculation was running. She could see it. The same calculation she'd watched him run in the boardroom the night he destroyed her. The assessment of remaining options, the angle of escape, the narrative that could still be constructed. And she watched it arrive at its result, which was that there were no remaining options, and watched the moment he understood that. You can't prove the medical... he started. Gregor Sell turned himself in this morning. She'd learned this from Greta 40 minutes before leaving Aldgate. Sell, the consultant, had been picked up by federal agents the previous evening and had spent the night making decisions about his future. He has documentation, his own records. He kept records, Damien, because men like him always keep records. It's the only leverage they have. She held his gaze. He gave them everything. The red light, the noise of a room full of people beginning to understand that something was happening that wasn't a power failure. Damien looked at her for a long moment, and then something in him that had been held at tension for years, the performance, the architecture, the exhausting engineered surface of a man who had built his entire existence on the management of other people's perceptions, let go. Not dramatically, the way a structure fails, quietly, then completely. I needed the company, he said. His voice was different, smaller, the real voice, she understood, the one that had always been underneath. Your father wasn't going to give it to me. He saw what I was. He was going to push me out before the Asia-Pacific expansion. I had 1 year, maybe less, before he found a reason. And the company was going to be worth 3 times what it was worth when I came in. He stopped, started again. I built that value. I was part of that. You were part of it, she said. That wasn't enough for you. It was never going to be enough. He was going to hand it to you, all of it, to you, and I would have been... He stopped. A man who had to earn what he wanted, she said, instead of taking it. His jaw moved. He looked away from her for the first time, toward the room, toward the formal architecture of Blackmere wealth that surrounded them and had always been, she understood now, the actual object of his desire. Not her, not the work. The room. The way the room looked at you when you owned something it respected. The company is being legally restored to my control, she said. The board resolution is complete. Greta filed the paperwork this morning. She paused. I want you to know that. I want you to know it happened before you go anywhere. 2 federal agents came through the service corridor entrance. Diana Cho was behind them, her charcoal suit unchanged, her expression the contained focus of someone who had been waiting for a specific moment and recognized it arriving. Damien watched them come. He didn't run. She had half expected him to try and had prepared for it, but he didn't. He stood and watched the agents approach and put his phone in his pocket with a deliberateness that was the last organized gesture of a man whose organizing principle had just been removed. One of the agents said his name and the legal language that followed it. Damien Cross looked at Selene once more. A long look, the kind that has too much in it to be classified as any single thing. Then he looked away and didn't look back. She watched them take him through the service corridor. The room was very loud now. Voices, movement, the specific energized chaos of a crowd that has witnessed something it doesn't fully understand but recognizes as significant. Phones were out. The lobby press had come through the main doors. Somewhere a woman was crying, though Selene couldn't identify her and didn't look. She stood in the red light in the blood-colored dress and breathed. Lucien was beside her. He said nothing. That was the right thing. And he knew it was the right thing, and she was aware of his presence the way you are aware of something load-bearing, not always visible, not announced, simply structural. After a moment, she said, "Where's Vivica?" Cho's team picked her up an hour ago. She went voluntarily. A pause. Her testimony is part of the federal package. She'll get a deal, probably a small one. Cho wants the larger architecture, not the facilitators. Selene looked at the place where Damien had been standing. The floor there looked the same as everywhere else. The ballroom didn't know what it had held. "Marcus fell," she said, "waiting in the west alcove. Has been for 40 minutes. She almost laughed. Not from happiness, from the specific absurdity of Marcus Fell, 68 years old, a man whose entire career had been an exercise in not being in the wrong place, waiting in an alcove because a woman he'd failed to defend had asked him to, and he had been too guilty to refuse. It was the kind of detail that was too particular to be ironic and too human to be dismissed. "I'll talk to him," she said. "Give me 10 minutes. Lucien nodded. She found Marcus in the alcove, as promised, his champagne glass empty and his posture that of a man who had been sitting with himself for longer than was comfortable. He looked up when she appeared and stood immediately, which she read as respect and also as the physical expression of guilt looking for a way to discharge. "Selene," he said. "Sit down, Marcus." He sat. She sat across from him in the narrow alcove space, the party noise muffled by the half partition, the emergency lighting painting everything in the same red register. "You knew," she said, not accusatory, just factual. He was quiet for a moment. "I suspected." The documentation was very clean, too clean, the kind of clean that comes from resources most individuals don't have, and Damien's manner in the boardroom. He stopped. "I had doubts." "And you didn't say anything?" "No." He looked at his empty glass. "I have been trying to construct an explanation for that for 3 weeks. I haven't found one I'm willing to stand behind." "Then don't," she said. "I don't need your explanation. I need your board vote." He looked up. "The company is being restored to my control legally. The board will need to ratify the leadership structure within 30 days. I need to know whether I have your vote." She held his gaze. "And I need to know whether you'll call the other members tonight, before this room finishes processing what just happened and everyone goes home and the window closes." He was quiet for a long moment. "You have my vote," he said, "and I'll make the calls." "Tonight. Tonight." He put the empty glass down. "For what it's worth, Selene, your father knew you would be the one to fix it, whatever happened. He told me that the last time I saw him. He said, 'She'll fix it, whatever they do. She'll fix it because she can't do anything else.'" The alcove was very quiet. She sat with her father's words in Marcus Fell's mouth and felt the weight of them settle in the particular way that things settle when they've been traveling toward you for a long time and have finally arrived. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She left him there and walked back into the red-lit ballroom and found Lucien exactly where she'd left him, and she said, "Take me out of here." And he did. The night outside was cold and clear in the specific way of Blackmere in late November, when the harbor wind had scoured the cloud cover away and left the sky hard and black and full of detail. The city noise from the hotel entrance faded as they moved toward the car, and Selene walked with the particular quality of exhaustion that comes not from physical depletion, but from the release of sustained tension. the body's honest accounting once the requirement of performance is lifted. Her ankle throbbed. She had forgotten about it during the preceding 2 hours, and it was reminding her now. She got in the car. Lucian got in beside her. Neither of them spoke for a while. The driver took the harbor road, the long way, and the city unspooled outside the windows in its usual indifferent beauty, and Selene watched it and thought about her father, and about the 6 years she had lost, and about the company she was going to rebuild with a new name and a structure that had no room in it for the kind of access Damien had used. "Porter," she said eventually. "Out of Blackmere as of this morning," Lucian said. He gave Cho a full account of his dual employment before he left. It cost him the deal he thought he had with the Carver operation. What happens to the Carver operation? It loses its political protection when Damien's connections collapse, which leaves it exposed on 2 federal cases and 1 ongoing state investigation. He paused. It'll contract, significantly. "And your operation?" He was quiet for a moment. "Changes." She looked at him. "The harbor logistics," he said. "The distribution infrastructure. Most of it can be restructured as legitimate freight. It has been moving toward that for 3 years. Porter's access slowed the process, complicated it." He looked out the window. "The parts that can't be legitimized get wound down. That costs you money." "Yes. And people." "Some." His jaw shifted. "The people who've been with me longest are the ones who want the transition most. They have families, they're tired." She thought about that. The specific human texture of it, not an abstraction about criminal organizations restructuring, but men and women who had spent their working lives in something that operated at the margins of everything, and who were tired of the margins and wanted something that didn't require them to look over their shoulders. "It'll take time," she said. 3 years? Maybe 4? A pause. "Longer if I'm cautious." "Be cautious," she said. Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. The real thing was subtler, lived in the lines around his eyes rather than his mouth, and she had been learning its geography for weeks. The car moved through the tunnel. Amber light again, intermittent. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Ask." "The night I was walked out of the building, the cameras, the rain, you were already there." She watched him. "You'd been watching me. Before the frame landed. Before any of this." "Yes." "How long?" 4 months, he said. "Since the internal audit request you filed on the Asia-Pacific division. When you filed that, it triggered a flag in the financial monitoring I'd been running on Damien's network. I started watching your situation." He looked at her directly. "I was watching when the accident happened. I was watching when the board meeting was moved up. I couldn't move fast enough to stop the frame. I didn't have the full chain yet, but I had enough to know what was coming. And you let it happen." He was quiet for a moment. "I let the frame land, yes, because stopping it would have required exposing my knowledge of Damien's network, which would have compromised the larger case and put you in proximity to my operation before you had any context for it." He held her gaze. "I have spent 3 weeks finding different ways to tell myself that was the right calculation. I'm not certain it was." She looked at him for a long moment. "It cost me everything I had," she said. "I know." "And you're not going to tell me it was necessary." "No," he said. "I'm going to tell you it was a decision I made with incomplete information and genuine consequences, and that I've been living with the weight of that since the night I watched you walk out of your building in the rain." He paused. "And that the note under the door was the least I could do, and was nowhere near enough." The tunnel ended. She looked out at the city. "I know," she said. They sat in silence for the rest of the drive, and it was the kind of silence that has been built out of the same materials as trust. Not comfortable, not resolved, but honest. She had spent 6 years inside a comfortable silence that was a lie. She knew the difference now, shit. The weeks that followed had a different texture from anything that had come before. The federal case moved fast, faster than Greta had projected, because Gregor Sell's documentation was more comprehensive than anyone had expected. The record-keeping of a man who had understood from the beginning of his arrangement with Damien that his safety lay in having something no one else had. The Helix Meridian chain was fully mapped within 10 days. Damien's financial records were unsealed within 2 weeks. The media story Damien had positioned to drop and destroy her landed, instead, into a news cycle that had already been reshaped by his arrest, and it was received not as an exposé, but as a piece of desperate preemptive narrative from a man in federal custody, and it died in 2 days. Vivica's deal was exactly what Lucien had predicted: small, in exchange for testimony that Cho needed to close the conspiracy charges. Vivica would serve time. Less than she deserved by some measures, and more than she'd expected by others, which was the particular arithmetic of the legal system operating as designed. Selene was asked by Greta whether she wanted to make a victim impact statement that addressed Vivica specifically. She thought about it for 2 days. She said no. Not from forgiveness. She understood that forgiveness, if it came, would be a thing of years and not weeks, and she was not going to perform it prematurely. But because she had learned in the preceding month the specific cost of letting someone else's actions determine your next move, and she was not going to let Vivica determine this one. She wrote a statement about her father instead. She stood in a federal courtroom on a Thursday morning and read a document that described Edmund Veyne, his work, his character, his careful and systematic love for a company he had built because he wanted to leave his daughter something durable, and the specific, calculated nature of what had been done to him and to her. She read it in a flat, steady voice and did not look at Damien, who was in the room, and when she was done, she folded the paper and put it in her jacket pocket and walked out of the courtroom and stood in the marble corridor outside and pressed her back against the wall and breathed for 30 seconds until the thing in her chest that had been building since she started reading found a way out. Greta appeared beside her. "Good," Greta said, which was, from Greta, the fullest expression of emotional support available, and Selene received it as such and was genuinely grateful. The company came back to her in stages, each stage requiring a different form of fight. The board ratification went through with Marcus Fell's calls behind it, 7 votes to 4, which was not the unanimous vindication of a fairy tale, but was the functional majority of a working democracy, and she accepted it. The name change was her first unilateral act as restored CEO. Crossvein Holdings became Veyne Group, and the night the legal filing went through, she opened a bottle of wine in Greta's conference room at 11 p.m. and poured 2 glasses and said nothing for a long moment while the filing confirmation sat on the table between them. "Your father would have changed the name years ago," Greta said. "He wouldn't have wanted to upset the investors. He was too careful sometimes." "Yes," Selene said. "He was." She rebuilt the executive team in her own image, people she had observed over years and filed away as the kind who did the work without needing to own the room, the kind who were moved by the quality of what they were building rather than the visibility of their own contribution. It was slow and specific, and she refused to rush it because she had learned the cost of insufficient care in the selection of people you trusted. She moved out of the Aldgate building 3 weeks after the gala. She had stayed longer than the operational necessity required, and she and Lucien had both understood why without discussing it directly. And when she found an apartment in the Crescent District, a renovated pre-war building with high ceilings and windows that faced west, toward the harbor rather than toward the financial district, she told him over coffee in the Aldgate kitchen, and he nodded and said it sounded like a good building and asked about the light. "Good in the mornings," she said. "I checked." "You would," he said. She moved in on a Saturday. She owned almost nothing, the salvaged remnants of a life supplemented by what she'd acquired in the preceding weeks, which was less than she might have expected because she had discovered during the period of having nothing that the category of things she actually needed was smaller than she'd believed. She put her father's photograph on the windowsill facing west, where it would get the morning light she'd checked for. The city looked different from these windows than it had from the Crossvein penthouse. Lower, less elevated, more like the actual texture of the place rather than the overview of it. She had grown up near this part of the city. She could hear on certain evenings the particular ambient sound of the harbor at low tide, which she had not heard since childhood, and which turned out to be one of the things she had needed without knowing it. Lucien came the following Saturday. He brought nothing, which she appreciated. No flowers, no grand gesture, nothing that would have required her to receive it with the specific performance that grand gestures demand. He stood in her new living room in his usual black and looked at the windows and the photograph on the sill and the sparse, clean arrangement of a woman who was starting again with full information about what she was starting. "Good light," he said. "I told you." She made coffee. It was a thing she had started doing again, making coffee from actual beans in a machine she'd bought with her first paycheck from the restored company, a small domestic ritual she had abandoned during the efficiency years of her marriage, and whose absence she now understood as one of many small surrenders she had not noticed making at the time. They sat at the table by the west windows, and the harbor was a gray strip in the distance, and the city moved through its Saturday morning in the unhurried way of a city that didn't need her attention. "Your federal contact," she said, "the case against the Carver operation. Filed last week. 3 of their senior people are in custody." He held his cup. "The political protection evaporated faster than I expected. Apparently Damien had been managing several relationships they were depending on, and when he fell, the relationships fell with him. One man holding too many threads," she said. "It's a structural flaw," he said. "You build something on one person's management capacity, it has a single point of failure." She looked at him. "Is that a lesson you apply to yourself?" "I try to." A pause. "Not always successfully." She nodded. Outside, a boat moved across the visible strip of harbor, slow and purposeful, leaving a wake that spread and flattened and was absorbed. "I've been thinking about my father," she said. "Not the way I was thinking about him during all of this. Not instrumentally, not as evidence, not as the thing they took from me. Just him." She looked at her coffee cup. "He used to say that the only honest thing you could do in business was make something that worked without you, that if it needed you to survive, you hadn't built it right." She paused. "I spent 12 years building something that needed me. And then, when I was gone, it became something else entirely. Because of who was left in it," Lucian said. "Because of who I'd let in." She looked at the photograph on the sill. "He knew. He tried to build the protections in. I didn't understand what he was protecting against." "You do now." "Yes." She let that settle. "I do now." The apartment was quiet, the good quiet of a place that was genuinely hers, without history in the walls, without the residue of performance and compromise in every room. She was going to have to learn it slowly, the way you learn any new thing. The particular sounds it made at night, the quality of its different lights, the small domestic geography of a life being reestablished. "I need to ask you something," Lucien said. She looked at him. "The things I told you about watching you, about the calculation I made that let the frame land." He set his cup down. "I want to know whether you've decided what that means." She thought about it honestly, which was the only way she knew how to think about things anymore. "I've decided that you made a decision with costs I paid," she said, "and that you've been honest about it, which is more than most people offer, and that I'm not going to pretend the costs weren't real, because they were, and my father is dead, and I had 6 years taken from me, and pretending otherwise would be a form of dishonesty I don't have room for." She paused. "And that I've also decided you are not the reason I'm here, or the reason any of this happened, and that the weight of it belongs to Damien and Vivica and the structure they built, not to you." He was quiet. "That's not absolution," she said. "I know. It's just accuracy." She held his gaze. "I'm done with inaccurate accounts of things." He looked at her for a long moment. The morning light was changing, the harbor gray brightening toward blue as the cloud cover shifted, and it moved across the room in the slow way of light that has distance to cross. "So am I," he said. It was not a declaration. It was not the architecture of a promised future or the gesture toward a version of themselves that would resolve everything cleanly. It was just a man and a woman at a table with the truth of what had happened between them and the city outside going about its business, and the morning light doing what morning light does. She put her hand on the table between them. He put his over it. Outside, Blackmere moved through its December Saturday. The harbor traffic, the market stalls on Crescent Street, the particular urban percussion of a city that did not stop for anyone and did not offer apology for that, which was one of the things she had always loved about it. You had to take the city on its own terms, and its terms were that it would not remember you unless you made it, and that it would try to bear you if you showed weakness, and that if you survived it, you would understand something about yourself that softer places couldn't teach you. She had survived it. The woman who had been walked out of her building in the rain did not exist anymore, not because she had been replaced, but because she had been completed. The things that had been done to her had added to her in the way that damage sometimes adds to things, not despite itself, but through itself, the way certain materials are stronger at the broken places than they ever were whole. She thought about her father. She thought about the compliance protocols he had built into the company's structure, the secondary authorization requirements, the audit frameworks that Damien had circumvented by making himself the person she trusted most. All of it patient and careful and built out of the specific love of a man who understood the world his daughter was going to have to navigate and wanted to give her every advantage he could, knowing it might not be enough, building it anyway. She was going to rebuild the company, and she was going to build it the way he had wanted her to build it. Not proof against betrayal, because nothing was proof against betrayal, but honest in its bones. Clear about what it was and what it required and what it would not become. That was the work. She looked out at the harbor. The boat she had watched earlier was gone, absorbed into the gray-blue distance, its wake long since flattened by the weight of the water above it. On the windowsill, her father's photograph held the morning light. Lucie's hand was warm over hers. The city went on. She let it,